Welcome to Kayak Fishing Unboxed. I'm Peter Ritchie. Today we're going to talk about the perfect kayak, or more importantly, what perhaps makes up the perfect kayak and what may be perfect for you. Most of this revolves around the stability of the kayak and what you need a kayak for, your purposes, where you intend to use it, and how you intend to fish out of it. So we're going to run through a few of the basics of kayak stability to start with, just to give people an idea of what they actually need to look for when they're deciding on what is the perfect kayak for them. So we're going to talk about the stability of the kayak, and we're going to talk about the length and the width and how that affects it. So first of all, the length. As you may know, on many ocean-going kayaks, if you look at them, they're long, skinny kayaks, pointy at both ends. Not very good at drawing, but anyway. And the reason for that is, and I'll just change ink color, is that as the kayak moves through the water, it has to go around the kayak like that. It goes along the kayak and it gets to the other end, and then it joins back up again. So the greater the width of the kayak, the further the water has to go around it. So while it's skinny and while it's long and skinny, the water doesn't have to go as wide around the kayak. Therefore, it can move through the water more smoothly. The other thing you'll notice with the ocean-going kayak is the narrow, it is pointy at both ends. And even on ocean-going racing yachts, you'll notice that. It's pointy at both ends. The reason for that is it reduces drag. As the water comes around here, there's just a little bit of drag through here where the water meets up again. If you look on a square kayak, a square stern kayak, you'll see there's actually a lot more turbulence behind the kayak in this area here. And this is where the water comes back in and creates drag. So that actually slows the kayak down. But the trade-off for speed is stability. So a narrow kayak, although it will travel faster through the water because it has less overall resistance, is actually less stable because it's designed for speed. If you look at a different sort of kayak that's going to be a little bit more rounded at the back and fatter and shorter, you still pretty good drawing. It's going to be a lot more stable because the kayak has a lot more width to it, and we'll explain that in a second. But it's slower because the water's got to go a lot wider around the kayak to get to the other end. We also had this drag effect here at the other end, where the water is actually pulling backwards into the kayak and it slows it down. So the wider the kayak here, the more stable it's going to be, but the slower it's going to be. So even if it was a long kayak, if it's wider, same length as this one, but wider, it's still going to be slower because you've got to displace the water further around the side of the kayak. So that's how the stability is affected by the length and the width. So the trade-off, if you want a fast kayak, long and skinny. If you want a super stable kayak, short and wide. The difference obviously is paddling through the water or pedaling through the water, whichever method you choose doesn't affect the kayak as such. A short, fat one is going to be harder to move. So you need to take that into consideration if you're going to be traveling any distance in the kayak. Obviously on a long trip, you just don't want a short, fat kayak. You also need to be aware that in a strong wind, a short, fat kayak is going to be harder to paddle. And also it is going to be harder to paddle in waves. So on a flat surface, like a small lake or a small river, great. You don't have to go great distances. Then the stability could be more important than the speed. So being able to stand up or at least sit comfortably and have a wide kayak might be preferable to be going any distance. Okay, so we'll move on to the next screen now. Just give me 1 second. Primary stability and secondary stability. So what is that? Okay, so again, fast skinny kayak, wider slower kayak. This width here is what gives you the stability. So that's narrower than that. Excellent. So this kayak is going to be more stable. So when you sit in it, the water's going to sit there. You've got a lot more water, a lot more kayak in the water below you. So the tendency to rock sideways from one chine, these are the chines, to the other, is less. When you sit in a kayak like this, which is a lot more V-shaped rather than flat, the water level's here. So you see you've got a lot more chine and a lot less distance than the fat kayak before it starts rolling to its side. So that's what the primary stability is. So in a short wide kayak, you're going to have lots of primary stability, so it's not going to wobble much. And people commonly refer to this as, but it feels tippy when I get in it. That's because there isn't a lot of kayak directly below you or to your sides. So the moment you sit in this, it's going to feel like it's going to rock side to side until it's sitting flat, basically flat on that surface there. With this one, it's already sitting on a flat surface, so it's going to feel stable. However, where the difference between the two is the secondary stability. So if you imagine the short fat kayak in a wave, you've got a wave coming along like that. Your fat kayak is sitting here. It doesn't matter how far you lean over in the kayak, it's going to be sitting flat on that because that's how it's designed. As the wave comes along, the kayak's just going to tip up on its side like that. You can't lean against the wave because it's got a lot of primary stability. So over you go. However, when we look at a kayak that's got not as much primary stability, but greater secondary stability, you're sitting here in your kayak, so we just use the V shape, but as the wave comes along, you can actually lean into the wave because of the shape of the kayak, and it's got more secondary stability, and you won't tip over. Or ideally you won't, because you can actually lean into the wave using the lack of primary stability, which will allow you to lean into the wave and stop you going that way. You just let the wave go underneath you and you pop out the other side. So they're quite different techniques of how to manage the primary and secondary stability. And it's a bit like riding a bike, even riding a surfboard. If you just try sitting on a bike or standing on a surfboard while it's not moving, it's very unstable. Same with a kayak if it's got a low primary stability. Sit in it, it's going to tip you, feel unstable. The moment you start paddling and moving forward, then there's an increased feeling of stability. And there's probably a fantastic physics theory for it. Same as riding a bike, same as a surfboard. Once you start moving, you increase your stability and you can sit on it comfortably. So certainly there's nothing wrong with either model. They're both different. And that's the one thing about kayak fishing. There's nothing right, there's nothing wrong. It's just what is going to best suit your needs as a kayaker. But understanding what is primary stability and what is secondary stability will help you understand, or help you might make a decision about which kayak you want to buy. Okay, next slide we will go to center of balance. Okay, so we're just using call it a typical size, typical shape kayak, bit of a cruising kayak, paddle kayak. Doesn't matter about the brands at all. We're just talking about the physical dimensions. So the center of the balance in the kayak is generally going to be, we'll go back one. The center of the balance is going to be on around where the seat is, and that's how the kayak's designed. So generally you find it's probably about halfway between the front and the back. It's also going to be the widest part of the kayak, and this is as a general rule, and that's where the most weight's going to be centered in the kayak. And they're going to try and put it as central as they can in the middle of the kayak lengthways, and then also widthways. So that's where you want the weight to be, in the middle. What affects the center of balance is going to be when people put eskies behind the kayak here. So you might put an esky here and have some more gear stacked back here, and you got your fishing rods out here. That all affects the center of the balance. And unfortunately, one of the things you see a bit is, and we'll just change the color here, is that people will be sitting in their kayak and they'll reach around behind them. So someone's sitting in their kayak here, as you normally would. You want to get something out of the esky here. So they actually, they don't just put their arm behind them, they lean over around the side of the chair to get something out of the esky. What you see happen here is that all of a sudden is that the center of balance is moved from here is to here. So all the weight's now at a skinnier part of the kayak. So the further back you put that weight, the less stable the kayak becomes, because now it's narrower. And we know from the first slide that a narrow kayak is less stable than a wide kayak. And so even sitting in the same kayak, here's the stable portion in the middle. That's the most stable portion. But as you move backwards, it's becoming less stable because it's coming narrower. The same with the front end. If you lean forward to get something out of this front hatch here, you've now moved the center of balance way up here. If you were kneeling here, but you can see the kayak is a lot narrower here. And we already know that narrow kayak is less stable. So if you move the center of balance too far from one end to the other, you're going to decrease the stability of the kayak. So sitting in this kayak in a normal position, it could feel super stable. But once you move backwards or move forwards, you move to a skinnier part of the kayak, and you'll find that at the back of the kayak, the shape's like that, and at the front of the kayak, the shape's like that, and in the middle, the shape's like that. So you've gone from the middle center of balance, which has got a high primary stability. If you move the weight forwards, you've got low primary stability, and if you move the weight backwards, you've got low primary stability. So you need to make sure if you're sitting in your kayak, one rule, try not to turn around to get anything out the back or behind you. If you need to store things, try and store whatever you can in front of you, or under you, or around you, or really close to the back of the seat so that you can reach it with your arms, but not actually physically having to turn around in your seat. Center of gravity. We had a preempt one, so we'll go to this one. Again, another kayak, doesn't matter brand, whatever. The center of gravity. So if you imagine the water lines along here is red water. The lower the seat, the lower the weight, the lower the center of the gravity, and therefore the higher the stability. So low C of G equals high stability. Now, so some kayaks will have a molded seat, and the molded seat will be right in the water line. You know that because when you're sitting in it, you get a wet bum. But it's got a lower center of gravity. Anything below the water line is good. Anything above the water line is bad. So the higher the center of gravity, the less stable the kayak. So again, you need to be cautious. If you're sticking a really high esky behind you, then you've got rods mounted above it. That is actually raising the center of gravity, which means that there's more likelihood of the kayak tipping over because now it's less stable. So you need to be careful about what you put above the waterline. And this is probably more directed towards the people who are putting electric motors on their kayaks as well. You start sticking a motor up high here at the back, and you got your battery up here, you've all of a sudden added a lot of weight well and truly above the waterline that decreases the stability by raising the center of gravity. So if you've got to put extra weight in your kayak, put it as low as you can. So rather than having a big tall esky, look for a low flat esky, or take advantage of whatever low storage there could be around the kayak to keep the center of gravity lower and to increase your stability. So what a lot of people don't realize is if you put an esky on the back of the kayak here, all right, beautiful esky. If you're looking at it from the side view, so you've got your kayak like this somewhere, you've got your esky sitting in here. Okay. Now, hot day, you put in a 5 kilo bag of ice, you put in a bit of water, and you put your snapper in there. Excellent. So you got your 5 kilos of water, you put in a few, 3 or 4 litres of water, your 5 kilo bag of ice, you got your water in there as well, you got a couple of kilos of fish. There's a thing that affects boating, and it's called the free surface effect. So while the kayak's sitting stable, all that's sitting nicely balanced and it's nice and low in the kayak. But because it's a liquid and this is all movable, the contents inside it, if the kayak tips on its side at all, so we say you hit a wave, you've got your esky here, the level will stay the same in comparison to the water level. So here's your water level on the ocean, here's the water level in the kayak. Now, because the kayak's tipped on its side, the esky's tipped on its side, but everything stays level in the kayak because it's liquid, because it can move around the kayak from one side to the other. But what you see now is rather than the center of the balance being through here, and so the weights distribute easily, you now look at this picture here, you can see that all the weight in the esky is moved to the side that's lowest, to the water. So you have actually decreased the stability of the kayak because all this weight's moving across this way. So it's actually going to make the kayak tip faster. So if you are carrying an esky with a lot of liquid in it, and when you think about it, I've just said 10 to 15 kilos there of fish, water and ice, and you're already close to the maximum capacity of your kayak. And that esky is sitting at the back of your kayak where it's skinny. This can have a big effect on how quickly it tips over, how quickly it gets to the point where it just goes right over and everyone goes in the water. So keep that in mind when you've got an esky in your kayak, is one, if you can put it lengthwise rather than crosswise. So rather than sitting in the kayak going that way, try and sit in the kayak going that way. Then the water in it can't move as far, as opposed to if it's widthwise, it can move from one side to the other. That will help reduce this. And also perhaps think of using frozen milk cartons, 2 litre, 3 litres, that will just jam across the bottom, bit of water on the top, the fish on it, that can't move around as much, and that will assist with maintaining a good centre of gravity. Okay, stability versus budget. Yeah, we had to preempt. This is probably the toughest one for everybody because not everyone can go and buy the kayak that they want. So it's always going to be a trade-off. We'll keep this short and sweet. It's always going to be a trade-off, what you can spend versus what you can afford to buy and what you get. A lot of people are buying short, skinny kayaks that are on special. They're cheap. They certainly have a place as a fishing kayak, but you'll generally find it's not in the open water. Because they're short, they're less stable. Because they're skinny, they're less stable. They don't have a great capacity. So the moment that you put more weight above the center of gravity, the less stable they become. And just because it says it's got a capacity of 120 kilos and you only weigh 90 kilos, that doesn't make it safe. It just means that by the time you put the esky on there with ice and fish and water in it, there's another 10 to 15 kilos. Throw an anchor on there and a few fishing rods and some tackle, you're getting close to the maximum capacity. That's not good because what they're saying is above that, it's unstable and you shouldn't use it. So do you really want to fish in a kayak where you're close to the maximum weight carrying capacity? Wind also affects them a lot more. They're harder to paddle if they're short. They're harder to paddle in a straight line with or without wind, but even in the wind and the waves, a short kayak is harder to paddle. So no one's saying don't buy short kayaks, but they have a place and it's generally going to be limited to small slow flowing rivers and obviously smaller lakes. Now, yes, you will get away with using it in different situations, but you need to remember that it is limited and don't become overconfident. Okay, so next question. Next slide. The perfect kayak. Well, we're going to just stop the screen share for a second. There is no perfect kayak. It's going to come back to exactly what you can afford and what you want to do with your kayak. The bit of advice that gets thrown around a little bit is perhaps look to buy a second-hand kayak that's more suitable than a brand new one. Keep in mind that one of the cheapest things about buying a kayak is actually buying the kayak. If it's a bigger kayak, you got to put it on a trailer. There's another cost. You've still got to fit it out. You may not need to buy fishing gear, but you probably need to buy an anchor trolley, depth sounder, rod holders, esky, wet weather clothing, PFD, PLB, torch. The list goes on. So it's quite easy all of a sudden to go, wow, I've got a budget, I'm going to buy this cheap kayak. But if that's all you can afford and you can't afford the safety gear or the proper clothing, you're actually really risking yourself because one, you've got a cheap, unstable kayak. And secondly, you're probably not going to fit it out with the correct safety gear to compensate for having a small, unstable kayak. So keep that in mind. It might not be the ideal what you want to hear, but it's about thinking about how much do I need to spend in total that's going to give me a safe option to go fishing from. Because it doesn't matter how experienced you are, how good you are, you can still drown in 2 meters of water. And for some people, that might only be a few meters offshore. And I watched a bloke one day, absolutely I knew this would happen. And most people tip over their kayaks because they lean around behind them, reach behind them to grab something, tips out. And I watched him do it. Brand new kayak, first time on the water. He's wearing a woolen jumper, no PFD and jeans. And I had a chat to him. He said, no, he'll be right because he knew everything. It was a 20 knot offshore wind blowing. We're down at Mornington. And I watched him, and I said to Dad, I said, most people fall over because they reach behind them. And fair dinkum, I reckon 15 seconds later, splash, turn around, and there he was, hanging on the side of his kayak. He'd tipped over, kayak was up, right? Watched him for a few minutes trying to get on, and he couldn't. He didn't have any PFD. He was wearing a jumper that got soaked. He's wearing jeans that got soaked, and it was freezing cold. It was the middle of the winter, and now he's starting to drift out to sea. So I went over and said, "Do you need a hand?" And he said, "No, he'll be right." And a couple of minutes went by, and he still wasn't right. So I didn't give him a choice. I just gave him a hand and dragged him back in. And I haven't seen him again for kayaking. He did lose a $250 rod and reel, which I think he came back and got a day or two later. But it was just a reminder of how quickly it can happen. And it doesn't matter how much skill or experience you've got, it still may happen to you. So think about that before you go buy your first kayak. Buying cheap is not good. It's not the best option. If it's all you can afford, think about what else you can do to make that kayak more safe than just on hope alone. I'm Peter Ritchie. Hopefully this has been helpful, and welcome and thank you for watching Kayak Fishing Unboxed.